We'll kick off tonight's webinar with about 55 minutes of presentations from our panelists, and we'll conclude with a 15-minute audience Q&A period. During the Q&A, feel free to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand to alert us to any questions. And with that, I will hand it over to our first panelist, Sophia Kruszewski.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I get to open things up tonight with a brief introduction to payment for ecosystem services. But I wanted to start first just by explaining a bit about what we do at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. We work in partnership with local, regional, national, and international partners to address food system challenges ranging from farm viability and farmland access, to food justice and security, to worker protections, to public and environmental health. And we work closely with our partners to provide legal services that respond to their needs and develop resources that empower the communities they serve toward building a sustainable and just food system. So our interest in payment for ecosystem services, or PES, came out of a partnership with two Vermont organizations, the Rural Vermont and the White River Natural Resources Conservation District, focused on ensuring that the exploration and possible development of a PES program in Vermont is farmer-led and equitably administered. So what is payment for ecosystem services? In the agricultural context, PES provides a framework through which farmers can be recognized and fairly compensated not only for the goods they produce, like food and fiber, but also the benefits that result from their stewardship of the land. For example, reducing soil erosion, preserving wildlife habitat, improving water quality, enhancing the soil's ability to store carbon or retain water. And it's a framework because there really is no uniform definition or approach to PES. And while most existing programs have focused on a single service, PES programs could theoretically target any number of ecosystem services, which could broadly include tangible or intangible environmental or cultural benefits to society, like recreation or even art or music inspired by connection with the environment. One definition by Gretchen Daly at Stanford that's often cited in the literature defines ecosystem services as the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. And as UCLA professor and legal scholar Jim Salzman, who I think I even saw his name in the participant list today, says in his writing, if you doubt this, consider how to grow an apple without pollination, pest control, or soil fertility. And I would really encourage all of you to read Professor Salzman's 2018 article, Payment for Ecosystem Services, Past, Present, and Future, which provides a really excellent analysis of existing PES approaches and categorizes them by voluntary, compliance, or subsidy approaches. And so in a voluntary PES program, interested buyers and sellers come together in the private market, for example, an airline company purchasing carbon offsets because it has made some kind of commitment to going carbon neutral. In a compliance PES program, a buyer has a regulatory obligation to meet. So for example, a developer purchasing an offset from a wetlands mitigation bank to meet its Clean Water Act requirements. And in a subsidy PES program, a public entity like a state or federal government is providing funding to farmers or landowners to generate ecosystem services on behalf of the public. Such programs would be voluntary, generally reliant on taxpayer dollars. But as both a scholarly discipline and a policy tool, PES is still relatively young. But the goals that PES programs seek to realize have certainly been around for some time, particularly in the agricultural context. How do we keep land in agriculture? How do we ensure farming is a viable profession? How do we encourage practices that preserve and enhance natural resources for the public benefit? How do we shift public perception to recognize farmers' roles as land stewards? And so PES offers a way to try and answer these questions. But domestically, over the past century or so, significant public funding has been going toward on-farm conservation practices. The first Farm Bill, enacted in 1933, focused on stabilizing the agricultural economy and addressing its environmental impacts. It established the Soil Conservation Service within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, now known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And today, the conservation title of the Farm Bill accounts for nearly a third of all of the agriculture-focused Farm Bill spending, with the most recent 2018 Farm Bill authorizing nearly $30 billion in conservation spending over a 5-year period. Much of this spending has gone towards a practice-oriented approach to conservation, providing cost sharing or payments to farmers to implement specific management practices on their farms, without necessarily monitoring whether those practices are resulting in the intended environmental benefits. So one of the main features of PES that's being touted over these more practice-oriented programs is that PES can be outcomes-based, which in theory provides a greater assurance that conservation spending is producing a desired environmental impact. And tying payments to outcomes instead of practices is also popular because it enables farmers to identify the best path toward meeting an outcome based on their specific farm and their specific environmental conditions. But as I think others on the panel may discuss further, there are costs and technical challenges associated with measuring outcomes on a farm-by-farm basis, which can limit PES program implementation, among other concerns about equity and access. And whether a PES program is framed as being more focused on a solution for farm viability or solving an environmental problem can carry important implications. Because while a PES program can certainly aim to support both, a program established primarily to solve an environmental problem would likely focus on doing so as efficiently as possible. This would mean that payments would go to those who can provide the greatest return on investment, which may be those who have neglected or degraded the services of their land, rather than those who may have already invested in or committed to more advanced land stewardship. But on the other hand, a program focused on farm viability can provide financial support to farms more equitably, rather than focusing, for example, only on those farms located in an area where a resource is of particular concern. It could also accommodate less certainty around outcomes, for example, enabling the use of modeling tools as opposed to on-site monitoring. And so timing is certainly ripe to be considering how PES approaches can best support these dual goals of farm viability and ecosystem health. President Biden's climate plan highlighted the role that farmers and the agricultural sector can play in addressing climate change. His plan for rural America proposes making American agriculture the first in the world to achieve net zero emissions, while also finding new revenue streams for farmers through carbon markets. And the recently confirmed Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, has signaled his interest in funding a carbon bank through the Commodity Credit Corporation to provide incentives for carbon sequestration on farmland and on forest land. And here in Vermont, the state legislature has established a payment for ecosystem services and soil health working group that is exploring financial incentives to encourage farmers to implement practices that improve soil health, enhance crop resilience, increase carbon storage and stormwater storage capacity, and reduce agricultural runoff. And I'm sure that Senator Pearson will discuss the legislature's work in more detail. So I'll just close by saying that, from our work in the Food and Agriculture Clinic, we see the legislature as having presented the working group with a really logical way to approach whether or not to pursue a PES program. Because first, the working group is charged with identifying standards and practices that already exist that farmers can implement, and identifying existing sources of funding for those practices. And as I mentioned before, and I think Jennifer will discuss in more detail, there is already a lot of public dollars going towards on-farm conservation. So can those programs be aligned or their funding otherwise be leveraged to support Vermont's goals without having to stand up a new program? And if it can't, then the working group is tasked with considering what new incentives are needed and how they might be funded. The working group has identified as their goal to catalyze a paradigm shift in how farmers are acknowledged and empowered to perform their essential roles of environmental stewardship, as well as providing food and fiber, which really provides a broad basis from which to consider these issues of program function and structure, eligibility and access. And so is a PES program the best way to achieve this paradigm shift? I don't know. I think it depends on a lot of factors. And I think there's still a lot to learn and figure out before that decision can be made. And so with that, I'm certainly very interested to hear from the other panelists' expertise and perspective. And I'll turn it over to Senator Pearson.
Great. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sophia. I am Chris Pearson. I'm a state senator in Vermont, representing the Chittenden County, which is our populous county, our big city of Burlington and the surrounding areas. And I'm in my third term there. Prior to that, I served in the House on behalf of my small neighborhood in Burlington. And it was at that time, that was about 8 years, it was around 2011, 2012, that I was one of the co-founders of what at the time was called the Climate Caucus, now called the Climate Solutions Caucus, and it's grown now to be the biggest issue-based caucus in Montpelier, well over 80 members. And that was, that just speaks to my experience and my perspective. If you've ever, maybe not this year, visited the State House, but over the years, if you've ever seen pictures of that big red room, it's a very dramatic room. You know, we still work in our State House. It's sort of like working in a museum. This red carpeted room is very dramatic and kind of gives you a sense of gravity as you're working there. And there's 150 members of the Vermont House. And I remember well sitting there and looking around the room with my colleagues, and there are days when you're sitting there all day, and thinking, you know, there's a climate crisis. Actually, most people in this room support the idea that the climate crisis is with us, it's a man-made crisis, et cetera. And we're not doing enough. We're not doing nearly enough, to say the least. And at that time, in 2012, I guess, we were sort of looking at energy policy. And so people would say, well, I got a climate bill. Okay, that goes to the Energy Committee. And there was no recognition that the climate crisis is a multifaceted, multi-jurisdictional crisis, and actually has to be addressed everywhere, whether it's the healthcare crisis, the healthcare committee, the Judiciary Committee, certainly the Tax Committee, certainly the Transportation Committee, and the Agricultural Committee, among others. So our attempt at the Climate Caucus was to elevate the issue generally, and then pop it out of these issue silos, which is frankly how the legislature works, based on committee. Fast forward a few years ago, I was named to the Senate Agricultural Committee, and was a little surprised to be there. In a way, I'd been interested in energy issues, and water quality had been on the forefront of the work since 2015, really, in the legislature, when we were brought to the table by the EPA, by citizen suits. And what you saw in the water quality debate was a sweeping set of mandates for farmers. And at the time, I was in the Energy Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. It's the same committee. And we were constantly battling with ag issues. And I think, and there was a real divide. So I think they said, next year, we're putting you on ag. And so suddenly I found myself in the ag committee. And I joke that I mow my lawn. I mean, that's the extent of my personal experience with agriculture. But I started to learn and find it fascinating to this day, and now serve as the vice chair. 3/4 of the open land in Vermont is controlled by dairy farms. We are more dependent than any other state on a single commodity, that is dairy. We have, as I said, in the past several years, radically changed our approach around water quality. That has meant required agricultural practices, all sorts of changes on the farm, and all sorts of public dollars going not just to farms, but generally to the approach of cleaning up our water. And at the same time, my own knowledge, and maybe more broadly, there's been a deeper understanding of the role for farms to play in the climate movement. And in the water quality discussions in Montpelier, it became very evident that soil health was vital to water quality and to retaining nutrients. And then it doesn't take very long to get to start talking about carbon sequestration, et cetera. All with the backdrop of a very struggling dairy economy, and with, we now are under 600 dairy farms. Many people a little bit older than me will tell you when we had over 3,000 in Vermont. So a real shift in what's going on our rural landscape. So we have to recognize that farmers, of course, need to earn money. They need to earn a fair living. I think when we started talking about ecosystem services, something that sticks with me was a farmer approached me and said, we've always been paid for ecosystem services, but just one of them, making milk. And we might think of that as a commodity or a product made on the farm, but it is interesting to think of a farmer creating inputs, working with the animals, and getting paid for one output. And this trying to expand that. And what I see is it's a way to value the work of farms in our communities, in the natural world, and in our economy. And one of the great benefits of the payment for ecosystem services approach is that I think we do better with incentives around the particular dairy farms, but the agricultural community better responds to incentives than mandates. That can be frustrating for somebody like me because I'm impatient, particularly around the climate stuff. But I think we have to work to get buy-in so that we ultimately, I think, are more successful. And when we think about the clean water work in Vermont and the millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars every year going to treat the problem. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, you know, as you would with your health, if your heart was a challenge, well, maybe you could have a heart transplant, or maybe you could have exercise and diet, right? And in the clean water sphere, it became obvious that one option for phosphorus, which is our challenge in Lake Champlain, among others, is to reduce phosphorus, but also to just address the problem upstream. Could you trap it in the soils? Could you put in less inputs, but also have the soils be healthier to trap the runoff? So that's where we sort of landed. At the same time as I was evolving in my own thinking, the broader, I think, environment around the farmers' discussion and academics were looking at this. And farmers really came to us and said, we'd like to explore this. We think there's real potential. And in the legislature, in any state in the country, quickly when you say, well, that's an interesting idea, how much is it going to cost? And I'm the people that said, wait a minute, we're spending millions and millions of dollars on clean water. We're spending millions of dollars on climate mitigation generally. Maybe, as Sophia said, we're spending millions of dollars on different programs through USDA and others. Maybe it's a question of reorienting. So we were able to get the framework together so that different people could start thinking about this and put details on paper and really understand the metrics. You can't do this in theory only. You have to have on the ground measurements. You have to have on farm measurements. One of the important principles that came forward was that this discussion be farmer led, that the bureaucrats, legislators, the people that are interested in the theory have a role to play, the advocates, environmentalists, but that farmers, you know, all throughout, for me, an important principle was the buy-in and the seat at the table for our neighbors and community members that may be asked to carry this out. So how we get there, I don't know. That discussion's been underway. It did get somewhat stymied by the pandemic, but has been re-energized, I think, right now. And I would just say, and I look forward to this conversation, I look forward to the questions, how we do this matters. It is not automatic that this is successful and that this is a good thing. It could be done very poorly. It could siphon money out of the public coffers, put them onto farms, as an example, and not deliver environmental benefits, or be done poorly in a way that really question, I think, the structure, or it could be done well. And that's why you'll hear me and others talk about the investment of the people at the table and getting the buy-in from the very community that would be central to this. So that's a quick snapshot from my point of view, and thanks for pulling us together. I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Senator Pearson. That was wonderful. And we are now going to hear from Paul Doton.
Yes, I guess I better speak fast. I've got more than 10 minutes worth of stuff to say. I am a dairy farmer, family dairy farm, small dairy farm in Barnard, just north of Woodstock. We are diversified. I will also mention that I'm also on the Vermont PES working group. And as Senator Pearson stated, we did go on sort of a recess for whether we wanted to or not. We're going to start up again, I think, the third week of March. And I also move quickly because several of the points I'm going to make were brought up already by previous two speakers. Just a few pictures of a farm, of our farm. Could you move it ahead one, Tim, please? maybe not. There. This is a picture from several years ago. My wife is very camera shy, and our 34-year-old son is even more camera shy, so you won't see you won't see him in our pictures. He is in the process, and I am in the process trying to retire, but it doesn't work, and to pass the farm on to him, the next generation. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Tim? These are the dairy cows. Obviously, you've all seen cows before, but we want to just make sure everybody understands they are part of the process. Next slide. The one on the left is my son. If it had been taken this summer, it would have been with our 2-year-old grandson sitting in the boosters of the buddy seat beside that 2.5-year-old who is going on 15 because he knows everything that's going on the farm. Now for the real part of the presentation, could you move to the next slide, please? In conjunction with the White River Conservation District and Jennifer Burns, we did have some farmer discussions in the White River area. Our group was formed because the eastern side of the state, the Connecticut River Watershed Farmers Alliance, the eastern part of the state really wasn't being observed because we did not have a problem. On the eastern side of the state, the big problem is nitrogen. And the Connecticut River is able to keep that moving south, and the problem comes up in Long Island Sound. There is not a lot of nitrogen that goes into the river, but there is some. And as I said, nitrogen is the bigger problem, but we're lumped in with the rest of the state, and we've finally started getting some more funds to help with whatever situation might not be proper, might not. This discussion group was a group of farmers and service providers, 15 or 20 of them, and they went through a very detailed process. The questions were asked about ecosystem services we provide, meaning the farmers. And I think you've heard the previous speakers talk about those: soil quality, soil health, clean water, carbon sequestration. And you could see the rest of them down there: flood mitigation. But the bottom one was an important one. Active farming itself is a service. And I think that's something that needs to be brought up in the forefront to make sure people understand that. Ecosystem services are provided by building organic matter and using different cropping methods to make sure that continues. As an aside, the state of Vermont has the highest organic matter of any state in the country at 5.4%. Planning for biodiversity, maintaining wildlife corridors. You can all read these, and I'm sure it's being filmed so you can see more. Nutrient management. On our farm, we also have a nutrient management plan. We've had it since the 1980s. It's interesting to make sure you know what the crop yield of each field is, and we did that before we had a nutrient management plan. If you could move to the next slide, Tim, please. The last one on there is providing natural habitat. The next discussion was about who was involved. And as Senator Pearson's mentioned, the entire community must be committed to this effort. Farmers are stewards of the land, and they provide value to all people. Once again, just to repeat, this should involve all Vermonters, not just farmers. And this one that gets under my crop occasionally is agriculture is not the largest contributor to pollution, yet farmers are being asked to bear the majority of the cleanup efforts. And we have stepped forward, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, 75% of the mitigation of the EPA rules of conditions in the Lake Champlain over the last year, 75% of that cleanup was done by agriculture. And as Senator Pearson's mentioned, this effort should remain farmer and forester led. And as Senator Pearson mentioned in a different way, farmers agree that penalties do not work to fix issues. This should be voluntary and should reward those who incentivize for good stewardship of the land and is paid for by all who benefit. Next slide. One that also I'm big on is measurement. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Baselines are also important. A standard baseline to be very complicated, as has been mentioned by the previous two speakers. Every farm is not on the same playing field. There are varying impacts and influences upon beyond the control of the farmer. We cannot rely on one test either, and not just soil health, but it's all the other parts that come into it. Natural resources, and measurements should be adjusted depending on the farm type, because a dairy farm has a different set of rules or a different culture is opposed to vegetables. And I'm not saying the two are bad, I'm just saying they're different ways of operating. A PES system should include a focus on evaluation, which would place a greater value on application of outcomes and not just performance, or not just practices, but performance. The majority of the attendees agreed that we want to value biology over technology. The system should reward biology and not the physics of farming. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned a couple times before, outcomes versus practices are the main point of this whole operation. With proper planning, farmers and conservation specialists already know when and where practice will produce a desired outcome, and not necessarily be told you have to do a certain practice, but by allowing the farmers to have a decision-making part of this process, you get a better outcome. Also, one that was brought up by the group was that having staggered payments, maybe the first to implement a practice and then a maintenance payment, should be ongoing as long as the practice continues. And a performance-based or maintenance-based system would be strengthened by formal planning, potentially using whole farm conservation planning. Next slide, please. The next discussion was about eligibility and equity. Concerns arose about the definition of farmers versus landowners and who would be eligible to receive funding in a PES program. This farmer group wanted to ensure that eligible land is actively farmed or in production, and that any payments and benefits go directly to the farmer of that land. In order to ensure equity throughout this system, we must consider differences between current stewards who are already doing conservation work and new conservation farmers who are just entering the system, so that no particular group benefits more. We also want to make sure that small farms get the same focus as large farms. Next slide, please. The one that brought up the most discussion was funding, and that's had the most discussion by the working group as well. And one of the potential sources is taxes on non-ag polluters, and a rooms and meals tax. Since farms contribute a great deal to Vermont's tourism industry. And then I think Senator Pearson mentioned that about a cap and trade model might be used in that system as well.
I apologize
and
for
there was a discussion about insurance, maybe the PS.
But if you want to give the audience any closing thoughts, that way we can keep the webinar rolling. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think he only has one more slide.
One was the existing programs are one to be looked at, and that's on the last slide. Thank you. Okay, I think the NRCS is the important factor there.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was really informative. And next we're going to hear from Jennifer Byrne.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see this. So Paul was about to mention the Conservation Stewardship Program and some of the USDA programs, so I'll take it from here. So it's really important for us to understand when we're talking about designing new systems that are about implementing conservation on the ground with farmers, is to understand everything, the programs that currently exist, and the money that's currently being spent in this area. So that's what I'm going to be touching on a bit today. So, another note is that I'll only be focusing on USDA conservation programs. In the state of Vermont, we also have state conservation programs, many of which overlap with these. But I won't be talking about state-specific programs tonight. So this is just a bit of an overview. The USDA provides technical and financial assistance to attract interest and participation in conservation programs. Participation in all USDA programs is voluntary, and all these programs endeavor to protect soil, water, wildlife, natural resources on privately owned agricultural lands to limit the impact of production activities both on and off farm, while still maintaining and improving the production of food and fiber. This list that you see here is a sample of the agricultural conservation programs included in the Farm Bill. And tonight I will be focusing in on these working lands programs. The working lands programs allow private land to remain in production while implementing conservation practices to address natural resource concerns. So the two that we'll be looking at is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. So EQIP is a practice-based program. You can think of it as shorter term. It could be a one-year contract if it's a practice that has a lifespan of, or a little bit. So it's more narrowly focused. It's based on addressing resource concerns, and there's a one-time payment after the practice is completed. And to give you a sense, in fiscal year 2021, there is $1.8 billion allocated to EQIP nationally. And on the other hand, CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, we'll be talking about a little bit of the differences. This is a 5-year commitment. We consider the entire operation and provide annual payments to support ongoing stewardship efforts, as well as an enhanced payment when a practice is completed. And so for fiscal year 2021, there is $750 million in CSP. That's actually historic amounts for CSP. As long as I've been involved with NRCS, which is 10 years now, it's always kind of been the question of, why can't we pay farmers for the good work they're already doing? Why do we have to have a resource concern before we can pay farmers? And with CSP, it was always this sort of, it existed, but it was never funded. So we're very excited. I'm very excited that CSP has gotten a renewed focus in the last 3 or so years, since 2018, and has more money than ever being allocated to it. So I'll go into a little bit about EQIP, and I'm going to talk about a few of the practices as well, just to make sure that we all are on the same page about what we're talking about. But first of all, the EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, assists farmers or farms, ranches, or forest production to improve and protect water quality. So the Farm Bill program offers financial and technical assistance to help ag producers voluntarily implement conservation practices. Any farmer, rancher, or forest landowner who owns or rents land is eligible. and EQIP offers payments for over 100 conservation practices to help all types of land managers and land stewards. So those applications are ranked based on the level of conservation benefits that will be achieved in meeting those objectives. So there are various measurement tools that NRCS staff use to help with that ranking and measuring and projecting some of the objectives. So some of the eligible practices, and I'll show a few examples of these: buffer strips, contour strip cropping, cover crops, critical area plantings, erosion control, grassed waterways, grazing management, livestock watering systems, manure management, et cetera, pollinator and wildlife habitat, and stream exclusion. So I'll show you a few pictures to get us all on the same page. So a planned grazing system, it improves vegetative cover, reduces erosion, and improves water quality. It can increase the harvest efficiency, help ensure adequate forage exists throughout the grazing season. It increases forage quality and production, which helps increase feed efficiency and can improve profits. And it also evenly distributes manure nutrient resources throughout the fields. Cover cropping, a lot of people are familiar with this. It's a close growing crop that temporarily protects the soil when crop residues are not present. That can be in between rows, or it can be after you take your crop off. And cover crops keep the ground covered. They add organic matter and nutrients to the soil, and it can reduce weed competition as well. Manure storage and manure management. Manure storage protects water bodies by storing manure until the conditions are appropriate for field application. Another piece of this is nutrient management planning, which Paul mentioned, which is really this kind of record-keeping component of manure management, where you have to balance the needs of your soil, the components of your manure, at the timing of when you're spreading and where you're spreading. Which protects water quality by preventing runoff and cuts fertilizer costs, reduces nutrient loss, and allows for field application when the conditions are right. Critical area planting is an example of a practice. This is a covering of vegetation that protects badly eroding areas from soil erosion. Reduces erosion, reduces sediment, nutrients, and chemicals running off, and protects unstable areas such as terrace slopes or gullied areas where vegetation might be difficult to establish. And it can also be used for wildlife habitat. Contour farming and contour strip cropping is a crop rotation and method of farming strips alternating crops. In this case, it's corn and soybeans, or you can be alternated with strips of oats or grass or legume. This reduces soil erosion and protects water quality, and it may help reduce fertilizer costs also by providing nutrients more naturally to the soil. A diversion is an earthen embankment. It's similar to a terrace, and that can direct water runoff from a specific area, and again reduces erosion by capturing that runoff and preventing it from reaching the farmland below. And another kind of similar practice with a little less disturbance is a grassed waterway, which is used to establish a natural drainage way to prevent gullies from forming by just making the water flow safely through and off the field. So it protects drainage way from gully erosion and can act as a filter. And stream protection excludes livestock from rivers and from buffer zones, and reduces the amounts of nutrients. Buffer zones provide cover and habitat for animals, and this can be coupled with a number of practices like a stream crossing. So cows or livestock can still access the river, but only a small portion of the river, and make their way through. So we just went through some of the practices that are covered in NRCS programs. So in an EQIP contract, one or two, several of these practices can be included in such a contract. But again, once that practice has been paid for, the contract is ended, it's typically one-time payment, where this conservation stewardship program is a bit different. So the purpose of CSP is to help agricultural producers maintain and improve their existing conservation systems and adopt additional conservation activities to address priority resource concerns. So CSP provides financial assistance for the cost of maintaining the existing system and practices on your land. And farmers are required to maintain that stewardship level of their farm for the full term of the contract, the 5-year contract. There is an option to renew for an additional 5 years in CSP, and there's a payment again for maintaining that stewardship level, and the contract must include at least one enhancement project, which is similar to like an EQIP project. So you can think of it as kind of one EQIP project inside of a CSP contract. So contract payments are made annually and based on these components. The existing activity payment is for maintaining the existing conservation system, and we'll get into kind of how they calculate that on the next slide. And then the additional activity payment for installing additional conservation systems, and then a supplemental payment if applicable. And this can, I think, vary by state, but an example of a supplemental payment is adopting or improving a crop rotation or an advanced grazing management system. So it's sort of that like extra enhancement that they want to see. It can also be included. So this
Jennifer, we are about at time. Would you like to leave the audience with any closing remarks?
Yes. So I guess I'll skip ahead. You can see here that there's math involved. These are measurements that are being taken and calculated by the NRCS soil conservation planners and soil conservationists. My final, I was going to talk a little bit about what conservation planning is, but I would like to maybe take it to the last slide, and for to take away from this and kind of think about is how does CSP differ? Does it differ from PES? How can whole farm conservation planning, which we didn't get to, but it's a critical component and it's required before you get any type of contract with NRCS, is you have to have a conservation plan. But how can whole farm conservation planning be used or enhanced to support a PES system? And then also I gave those numbers at the beginning. So, is the public money that's currently available for working lands conservation sufficient to support a PES system?
Great. I will now turn it over to Professor Kai Chan.
Hi, folks. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this really great session, and thank you to all the speakers before for their super insights. I can see an abrupt ending to my presentation in the future too, because as we've been going through the presentations, I realize there's so many extra things that I'd love to squeeze in as little points of clarification. In part because I'm sure that much of my talk is going to be somewhat provocative, and I don't think it's as irreconcilable as it might seem in some of these cases where it seems like I'll be saying something quite different from what other presenters have been saying. And I think the longer kind of arc through the presentation would get to those resolutions about particular places. But I'm going to wade through the kind of tensions and trade-offs just as I was planning to, and we'll stir up the pot and hopefully have a lively discussion. So hopefully you're seeing my screen right. I spent 3 years working on the IPBES global assessment, leading the chapter 5 on pathways towards sustainable futures, which resulted in this figure that you've perhaps seen already about the levers and leverage points towards sustainability. And one of the levers that everybody basically agreed on is this one about incentives and capacity building. Basically that no matter what we do, if we don't address the fundamental incentive structures that are faced by companies, farmers, landowners, consumers, etc., then we're not going to be able to navigate this transition towards a more sustainable world. So that's obviously where we're dealing here. But I do want to say that, you know, we didn't, in that context, say that the solution was to add on more positive incentives. In fact, what we argued was actually quite different from that, although, you know, sometimes that message gets diluted. We argued for the need for a pretty fundamental reform in incentive structures more generally. And one of the key points that we made there, which is for sure controversial, is that you basically can't throw enough good money after bad, right? That the existing structure of subsidies in many contexts is so great that it encourages behaviors, practices that are quite negative from an environmental perspective, and that it would be so costly to try to leave those subsidies in place, those which have perverse effects, and then to fill in the gaps through positive payments. Okay, so that's my first controversial statement. Hope to come back to it. The second point that we made in that context of the global assessment was basically that you can't think about these programs as being purely through an instrumental and intrinsic value lens, where, you know, we see this as about providing the incentives for farmers to do things that are of instrumental value to other people. And we pointed out there that actually, you know, this other kind of way of thinking about values, these values that are principles, preferences, and virtues, involving human relationships with nature, or sometimes mediated by nature, so relationships between people, all of these kinds of values are really crucial to understanding what makes payments for ecosystem services programs work in the way that they do. So the speakers that have come before have provided a great introduction to the basic idea of PES programs. So I'm gonna just kind of gloss over that and point out that in the literature, you see a massive divide between those who love them and those who hate them. And you know, this cover image from The Economist from 2005 represents one of those camps, the love them camp. But there's a pretty strong set of detractors, at least from the kind of narrowly economically interpreted kind of PES as like market transaction, especially from that school. But what I'm going to do over the next few slides is I'm going to go through the 7 major categories of critiques that are associated with PES kind of in general, and then start to pick out how those critiques might be turned around towards positive outcomes by subtle shifts that might still merit the term payments for ecosystem services, although things might be done differently than under the kind of narrow economic view, catering towards instrumental values. So the first of those problems is the problem of new externalities, where PES are often envisioned as correcting a market failure, but if you set up a market or a payment or what have you, for just one of those new ecosystem services, those kind of new commodities, then you run the risk of setting up new externalities, right? And we see that with REDD+ programs for carbon storage, that they have so strongly incentivized the storing of carbon or the sequestration of carbon, even worse, if it's only the sequestration without accounting for the fact that, you know, when you plant a eucalyptus plantation, for example, if you do so on land that was deforested for that purpose, obviously those are not net gains. The second problem that I'll highlight here is the problem that in setting up any of these programs, we are setting up institutions that effectively articulate rights and responsibilities, and that sometimes we do so in a way that, and Jim Salzman, who was mentioned earlier, has made some really important points to this effect going back a couple of decades now, I think, that sometimes we do so in ways that are unintentional. So, for example, this is that watershed diagram, by the way, from before, and I'll just flip back there, and it turned into bubbles and arrows. So you've got the upstream communities here, the ecosystem service providers and would-be degraders, And the idea is that here, the beneficiaries get to bear the responsibility. You can kind of bypass strong government action. That's seen as a good thing. Well, the problem, this kind of makes sense in the context where those who are moving into the upstream those who are in the downstream, for example, Nestle or Coca-Cola, a water bottling plant, where they seek to benefit off an ecosystem service, and the, say, subsistence farmers in the uplands. My work straddles both North American contexts and also South and Central American contexts, where those subsistence farmers in the uplands, might for sure benefit from receiving some extra payments to do things a little different to maintain that water quality. It makes less sense from a rights and responsibility perspective if you put all the responsibility on these beneficiaries. If the subsistence farmers are here and say industrial mining is in the uplands, right? And the programs then suggest that those industrial mining actors could be paid to lessen their negative impacts on watersheds. Now, not to say that that's actually the form that many programs are taking, but you get the point, right, about the intentional placing of rights and responsibilities. The third point is about motivational crowding out, where when these payments are seen as an incentive, and that's baked into the other name for IPBES programs as incentive programs, it envisions a world in which these people will have this positive incentive layered on that will trigger a change in behavior. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen as planned. I don't know how many of you know about this great classic study from Israel where psychologists tested the idea of negative payments, so fines, for a set of daycares, 5 in the control group, 5 in the treatment group, where a fine was introduced to try to curtail this problem of parents showing up late to pick up their children. Well, what you see here, you're not misreading this graph, is that the treatment group with the introduction of the fine in week 5 actually saw a doubling in the lateness that was maintained even after the late penalty was removed. Now, why did this happen? Well, in their words, it's because a fine is a price. What we had was a pre-existing set of norms, a sense of responsibility that parents in this case were using to motivate themselves to show up on time, but that were displaced by what appeared to be the extension of a fee-for-service model to displace a kind of decision that was based on respect for the daycare workers as well as children, right? So the pre-existing moral norm was displaced by the kind of transactional one with the introduction of the fine. Now, there's a bunch of other problems. One that was mentioned by Sophia Kruszewski right in the beginning is the problem of efficiency and equity, and that if we seek those transactions that make the most sense from an economic perspective, we seek to, one, only reward those where there is additionality, so overlooking the farmers who were already undertaking these kinds of practices, and also in many cases favoring the large farmers over the smaller farmers, because often the transaction costs are somewhat flat, so you get more bang for your buck. Now, this triggers a lot of resentment in many places, and in Costa Rica, some of the farmers that we interviewed through Molly Chapman's work admitted that they had accidentally let the forest burn because their neighbor who had not protected the forest was now eligible for payments that they were not eligible for because they had pre-existing protections for those forests. A fifth problem is about the burden of monitoring, where when farmers or landowners in general are being brought into these programs with the promise of profit, then there's a real incentive to cut corners, right? To take the payment and not do everything that was promised. And so many of these programs have to put a lot of the funding into paying for auditing and policing, right? For all of the kind of infrastructure of the program, rather than the money actually going to the farmers or landowners on the ground. So in some cases, the RED Plus programs, for example, actually very little, a minority of the funding actually goes to changes in management practice on the ground. I'm gonna skip this sixth one and go to the seventh one, where some of these programs, like the program in Costa Rica, which is quite famous, have paid farmers or landowners per tree or per hectare of forest protected. And that gets internalized as a kind of, one, as a commodity, but then two, can also be really frustrating from the perspective of farmers who, as mentioned already in many cases, have better ideas about how to get to the intended goal. So in Washington State, for example, there were no-touch buffers that were part of one of the voluntary programs that farmers were very frustrated about, because they understood that the point of the buffers was to improve water quality, but that they could see ways that if they could get in there and remove the invasive blackberry bushes, they could improve wildlife habitat without having a negative impact on water quality. And that didn't seem to be available as an option to them. So 7 classes of problems, but also the opportunity for some positive solutions to that. And so I'm going to just walk you through a really brief story from Australia, from the state of Victoria, where bush tender, this reverse auction program, was envisioned as a way to get enhanced efficiency of wildland protection through making farmers compete, or landowners compete, for their bids. Now, it sounds like some of the programs that Jennifer Byrne just talked about actually seem to have that structure. I don't know all of these programs that well, especially the national ones, because I'm more familiar with the Washington State specific ones and the BC ones in British Columbia. But in any case, they were worried that the farmers might collude, right? When there was an amphibian that was localized in terms of population, that the farmers who had those amphibians on their land would bump up what they were asking for, because the state would have to work with all of them, if not at least some. What they seemed to find was a really strong pattern of farmers underbidding, of basically asking only for some of the material costs while putting in their own time, which was the vast majority of the costs of the actions they were proposing, for free. What you set up in that context is the possibility to have the avoidance of cognitive dissonance work in our favor, in a sense, because farmers have to then justify these decisions that do take some extra expense by way of explaining that to themselves, that that's part of their identity, that a good farmer means being a good land steward and not just one who only seeks profit. So the idea there is basically that let's not forget values, that we won't achieve sustainable outcomes unless we foster not only ecologically sensitive behaviors, but also norms and identities. And so the notion here is to shift all 7 of these. Now, this one is going to be controversial. So rewarding stewardship, not the output. Now, not to say that you're not rewarding stewardship that yields outputs, but not to reward that on a farm by farm basis, but rather based on aggregate.
Did we lose him?
Professor Chan, I think we lost you. Are you still there? I can see that your mic is on, but I can't hear anything. We'll give him maybe a minute to see if he can log back on.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened there.
No problem. We can hear you now.
I was running out of time anyway, wasn't I?
That's okay. Continue.
Can I
Go
wrap
ahead.
up quickly? Yeah,
Sure.
sorry about that. That was terrible timing. I was in the middle of saying, then you set up the possibility of using an honor code and a peer monitoring system that is much less costly. it's also the case that we can bring in, as mentioned earlier, a much broader base of people to pay into these programs, because after all, it's our demand for these products that fuels these practices. And so we need to pay at a level that enables the production of those products while still also protecting nature and what nature does for people. And do so in a way, as mentioned before, that we are allowing the agency and the creativity where farmers and landowners can put in bids that involve their ideas, not our ideas of what would work well. And so here's our table that lays that all out. I'm not going to go through it. And they're labeled with the relational values that we coded. There is more that I prepared, ready to talk about. I knew I wouldn't get a chance to. I can, in the question period, talk about how these ideas resonated with farmers in Costa Rica, a bit more with empirical data. I also want to say that, you know, a big part of the challenge here is to think about not just how these incentive programs work in isolation, but also how they can be brought in with other kinds of solutions to really leverage those other kinds of solutions, including regulation, certification, and place-based approaches. So with that, I will just, I'll cut right to my end, and thank you for your patience and apologize for my interruption.
Thank you so much for such an informative webinar. Before we start the Q&A, I briefly want to thank the panelists for joining us tonight. Also, JURIST Editor-in-Chief, Professor Bernard Hibbets, JURIST Executive Director, Megan McKee, JURIST Social Media Coordinator, Gabby Wast, and Tim Zubizarreta for offering us tech support today, Professor Greg Johnson for helping us plan this webinar, and to all the Vermont Law JURIST chapter members for all their hard work organizing this event. And with that, we will now be taking questions from the audience. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or you can use the hand raise function at the top of the screen to alert us when you have a question.
I see a question in the chat direct to me. I can just jump in quickly if that's all right. So Hope Farm, so conservation planning asks certain questions. It's one-on-one technical assistance with the planner and the farmer, and it asks, what are the natural resources on my farm? What crops do I plan to plant? Have I minimized runoff? Am I using crop rotations to reduce disease and pest problems? What type of wildlife would I like to see? Do any of my practices interfere with or cancel out another practice? Can I use wetlands or filter strips to filter nutrients from runoff water? And am I making the best use of animal manure as nutrients for my plants? And those are all, it's a record of farmer decisions. And so based on your farm, what you plan to do, this conservation plan, you know, can be, you know, built out for the future. And if, you know, anything that's listed in a conservation plan, well, I should say it in the reverse. If you want to get financial assistance from the federal government, it must be listed in a conservation plan. So oftentimes they might just be written, you know, quickly and not focused on the whole farm, but with a greater emphasis on conservation planning and spending some more time and resources, staff time doing that type of planning. I see that as, you know, potential use in building out, you know, the future of what do we want to incentivize in Vermont? Is it regenerative farming? Is it rotational grazing? And you know, connecting that with some of the CSP money would be a way forward.
I'm seeing a hand from James Salzman.
Yeah, Jim Salzman, thanks. So first I wanted to applaud the organizers. I think it's great to have this wider range of perspectives on this. So as Kai said, I've been working on PES now for probably over 20 years. And one of the issues that comes up all the time, it came out in a lot of the presentations as well, and I'd be curious in the range of views on this, is what J.B. Rule and I called the tension between fat and sloppy and thin and bland. In other words, you want to make the program as simple as possible to get as many folks engaged as you can. But I thought Mr. Doton, I thought, did an excellent job pointing out, saying, hey, all our farms are different, which is true. But if you have a program that's based on taking into account how each farm is different, the program becomes expensive very quickly. And as Kai pointed out, most of the money going into the program goes to the consultants rather than to the landowners. And I'm sure you all have dealt with these issues, so I'd be grateful for what you've learned in your discussions and experience on this point.
How would you like us to go? Do you want us to just jump in, or do you want to call on us?
Go ahead and jump in.
Okay, I'll start off with that. It's so great to see Jim, it's to see you. It's been years. And this is a great question, and it's one that, I don't know that there's going to be an easy answer to this. I do think that you're pointing to an important trade-off. On the other hand, I think that we can distinguish from the costs that go into the transaction itself versus the costs that go into the monitoring. And I personally see those as potentially to disaggregate those, right? To separate them so that what I see in most cases, and I haven't done a thorough financial analysis of this, right? But just based on the published literature, it seems that in most cases when the costs, that kind of institutional costs of a program are really great, that it's not just the transaction cost, it's actually more the kind of monitoring costs. And the legal fees that go along with these, as thinking about these as contracts for particular deliverables. So that's why I personally favor a model where what the agreement is about the practice. The practice can be shown to have been associated with positive aggregate outcomes, but where farmers are not on the hook if, for example, some extreme weather event interferes such that despite their practice, some water quality measure doesn't actually go in the direction that's intended, right? So that the broader environmental outcomes are measured at the aggregate scale, and that we use the broader science to inform which practices to pay for where, but that where the payments are not conditional upon on-farm outcomes.
I agree with that completely. And I think, what you're describing is how the NRCS works largely, not that it can't be improved upon, but that's, the measurement of outcomes, trying to devise a perfect tool and a perfect test is where that real cost comes in. That the upfront contracting work, that's what NRCS does, is contracting for this type of payments. So that's already being paid for in a way. I mean, it's paid for by our taxes. And so it should be done as efficiently as possible. It should be done in the way that we want it to be done. So, we can have a hand in designing that, but it's already, folks are already trained in conservation planning and in working with farmers and assessing, more of a model, right? Using modeling tools as opposed to measurement tools.
If I could direct this to the senator, I'm curious if you have concerns about it being simple and stupid.
Yeah, I often say we can do it quickly, or we can do it in a fair way, which is sort of similar. Of course, public policy tends to be better understood and therefore maybe get better buy-in if it's simple. This is not simple, but there are some principles that are simple. One of them is sort of along the lines of, if you build soil health, we'll pay you. Good luck, right? That's simple. And for some farmers, that would be grazing. For some farmers, shifting to a grazing practice, or for others, it's crop rotation, what have you. I like that because it's leaving the decision with the people that intimately understand. But I also think there's the potential for what we're talking about to nudge farmers in a different direction. In the water quality work we've seen in Vermont, it's been a big lift, I think, culturally and financially and in practice for farmers. And in some ways what we're talking about is, well, what are the next few steps? We'd like you to do that. We'd like you to try this. well, you know, what is the motivation right now? Well, maybe the motivation says, you know, I take Kai's point about the preschool parents. Really interesting. I'm going to hold on to that one. But we're not talking about sort of let's keep you doing what you're doing. In some ways, I think it's like, hey, we'd really like to explore this with you. And well, why should I do that? Well, among other reasons, maybe there's some economic value to you. So I don't know, James, great question. I don't know if I've answered it, but that's my quick thoughts.
Unfortunately, we are nearing the end of the session. But before we go, I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone who made this webinar possible, and to our panelists, our host and audience for joining us. If you're interested, we are going to be posting the webinar on our JURIST YouTube page and the Vermont Law YouTube page as well. And if you're interested, though, we will stick around and field some more questions if anyone's interested. We did have a question actually in the chat that I wanted to get to from Gina Polino. She said, thank you for the great presentation. Could the other panelists provide their preliminary thoughts about what Professor Chan said about PES and the incentives being only part of the solution?
Can I take a stab at that right now?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so, you know, in much of the published literature and in all of the work that we've done across British Columbia, Washington State, Costa Rica, and elsewhere, it seems that most farmers that are enrolling in the programs, and many farmers that don't enroll in programs, already feel incentivized by doing what they think of as the right thing, right? And so what it seems from that work is that farmers don't need incentives so much as they need their costs to be covered, because many of these practices take additional costs, right? Now that's not true across the whole board, right? Surely there are some farmers that do need to be incentivized, but I think that we do a bit of a disservice to many of the farmers who are participating in these programs for other reasons when we suggest that, you know, that it is only providing incentives, because really, like, the first thing that these programs do is covering costs. And I think the additional parts of the program that are needed are the kind of recognition, the technical assistance, and yeah, and other pieces like that. Sorry, it's Elena, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry.
Okay.
My internet's going in and out, but I'm here.
Yeah, no problem. I know the problem.
So I will bring up also to build upon what Kai just said. Most farmers are incentivized on their own because they want the soil, the farm, to be better when they pass it on to the next generation. But as you said, some of those practices require money to cover them, like cover cropping, things like that. We found with our Watershed group that having a no-till seeder to rent out to farmers has been a real popular item, and that's, if the farmer purchases himself, he wouldn't be able to afford it, but be able to rent it out has worked very well.
Professor Johnson, it looks like you have a question.
No, I don't know why. I don't know why that happened. It's a great panel. I don't have a question. I'm just enjoying hearing everyone. But I didn't raise my hand. Nor do I know how to bring it down.
Is there anyone else who has a question that they would love to have answered before we wrap? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you to the panelists again, and thank you for bearing with us for some of our technical difficulties. But regardless, you did wonderful, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. It was really fun. It was great to meet you all. Have a great evening.
So great to meet you all, too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.